A racist doctor publicly humiliates a black nurse, mocking her in front of the entire hospital. No one defends her. No one speaks up. But then, Big Shaq stands. His presence alone shakes the room, but it's not just anger in his eyes. It's something deeper, something personal, because the woman being torn down, she's his daughter, and she has no idea. Now the man who once walked away has only one choice: stay silent or make things right. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The fluorescent lights above hummed faintly, casting a dull glow over the crowded emergency room. The air carried the sharp scent of antiseptic, mixed with something heavier: unspoken tension, quiet suffering, and the exhaustion of those who had been waiting for far too long. In one of the plastic chairs against the wall, Shaquille O'Neal sat, silent and still. A name known across the world, a face recognized in every city. Yet here, in the chaos of the hospital, he was just another man waiting his turn. His broad shoulders curved slightly forward, his hands clasped together, elbows resting on his massive knees. The weight of his fame, his fortune, his larger-than-life presence seemed to shrink against the gravity of the moment. Around him, voices murmured, "That's Shaq, right? No way. What's he doing here? Think he's sick?" Whispers bounced off the linoleum floors, but no one dared to approach him. He wasn't in the mood for attention. Not today. A young receptionist kept stealing nervous glances at him. A few interns nudged each other, debating whether they should ask for a selfie. But the look in Shaq's eyes, the deep, quiet contemplation, kept them at bay. He wasn't here for a publicity stunt. He wasn't here as a celebrity. He was here as a man, waiting, watching. And what he saw unsettled him. The hospital had its own unspoken rules, its own hierarchy. It wasn't written on the walls, but Shaq could see it, plain as day. A middle-aged white woman, coughing lightly into her sleeve, had been ushered into an exam room within minutes. A black man with a swollen eye and a split lip, clearly in need of immediate care, sat across from Shaq, arms folded, foot tapping impatiently. The nurse at the front desk barely glanced at him when he asked how much longer. "We'll call you when we can." Shaq could feel the frustration rolling off the man. Same injury, different treatment. A young Latino boy sat curled against his mother's side, his breathing shallow, cheeks flushed with fever. His mother's voice was urgent, pleading for help. "Please, can someone look at him? He's burning up." "Ma'am, have a seat. We'll get to you when we can." Shaq's jaw tightened. The system was broken, and everyone in this room knew it. Then he saw her. She moved through the chaos of the emergency room like a warrior in scrubs, her steps quick but measured, her hands steady. Her dark brown eyes flickered between patients, assessing, calculating, moving from one crisis to the next. The black nurse worked with the kind of precision and care that only came from years of experience, years of being twice as good for half the recognition. But Shaq also saw something else: the chains around her. Not physical ones, but invisible shackles. Ones made of constant doubt, of being dismissed, of being expected to endure more and complain less. It was in the way she carried herself, straight-backed and proud, but with a tension in her shoulders that told a different story. It was in the way her eyes flickered with defiance, but her lips stayed pressed together in restraint. And then there was the way she was being spoken to. "Nurse Tahira, where the hell have you been?" A sharp voice cut through the room. A doctor, tall, middle-aged, with neatly combed gray hair and an air of authority, stood with a clipboard in hand, his glare fixed on her. Shaq's eyes narrowed. The nurse, Tahira, was already gripping a patient chart, moving toward a wheezing elderly man. I don't need excuses, I need efficiency," the doctor snapped. "Maybe if you spent less time chatting and more time working, I wouldn't have to do your job for you." The words were cold, clipped, deliberate. Tahira didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just kept moving, but not before Shaq saw the flicker of exhaustion cross her face. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlacing. The room didn't react. No one called out the doctor. No one stood up for the nurse. Because this wasn't new. Shaq could tell. This was normal. And that made his blood run hot. For the next 20 minutes, Shaq watched. Dr. Langford, that was his name, continued his rounds, tossing thinly veiled insults at Nurse Tahira whenever he got the chance. Didn't they teach you how to do this in nursing school? Maybe pay attention this time, so I don't have to correct you later. Try not to waste my time. Shaq's fingertips drummed against his knee. The nurse took it all in stride, not a single retort escaping her lips. But Shaq saw through it, saw the way she clenched her jaw, saw the way her fingers tightened around a syringe, saw the way her eyes flickered with words she refused to say. And Shaq knew that feeling all too well, because when he was younger, before the fame, before the millions, before the world knew his name, he had been in her shoes. He had been doubted, dismissed, degraded. He had been talked down to, treated as less, forced to prove himself over and over. And now, sitting in this hospital, he was watching it happen to someone else, someone who looked way too familiar. Shaq's brows furrowed as he watched Nurse Tahira move across the room, adjusting an IV for a young girl. His mind raced. Why did she look so familiar? The waiting room doors swung open, and a man in a suit strode in, looking around as if searching for someone important. He barely glanced at Shaq before heading toward the front desk. "Excuse me, my wife is in labor. We need a private room immediately." The receptionist barely looked up. "Sir, we're at full capacity. You'll have to wait like everyone else." The man's voice dropped to a lower, firmer tone. "Do you know who I am?" Shaq felt his chest tighten. That tone, that entitlement, that expectation that rules didn't apply. The receptionist swallowed hard and quickly nodded. "Let me see what I can do." The black man with the swollen eye, still waiting. The sick Latino boy, still burning up. Shaq exhaled slowly. Money didn't just talk. It screamed. He looked at Nurse Tahira one last time as she hurried down the hall, disappearing into another patient's room. There was something about her. Something beyond the injustice she faced. Something beyond her defiance. Something personal. His eyes narrowed. Then it hit him. The resemblance. To someone he once knew. To someone he had walked away from. His chest tightened. His hands went cold. Number it couldn't be. But deep down, he already knew. This nurse? This woman being humiliated in front of him? She was his daughter, and she had no idea. The hospital hallways pulsed with urgency, monitors beeping, gurneys rolling, voices rising and falling in hurried conversations. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic, sweat, and the kind of exhaustion that settled deep into the bones. Nurses moved quickly, their white sneakers squeaking against the floor, some carrying trays, others pushing IV poles, each one stretched thin but powering through. And in the center of it all, Nurse Tahira O'Neill didn't slow down. She had no choice. Another patient. Another chart. Another glance at the clock that told her she was 3 hours past her break. But stopping wasn't an option. Not when she had people depending on her. She moved from bed to bed, checking vitals, adjusting dosages, offering weary smiles to patients who barely saw her. She was the backbone of this place. The one who did the unseen, unthanked work. And yet, no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. "Nurse Tahira!" The sharp voice of Dr. Langford cut through the corridor like a blade. Melissa turned, suppressing a sigh. Here we go again. Dr. Langford strode toward her, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses. Polished, professional, dangerous. The kind of man who knew exactly how far he could push without leaving proof. "Did you not read the patient notes?" he asked, stopping inches from her. Melissa blinked, caught off guard. "Sir?" He flipped the clipboard around, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against the page. "I specifically requested that Mr. Goldstein's meds be administered at 4:15. It is now 4:18, a 3-minute delay." Melissa's fingers tightened around the syringe in her hand, her grip turning her knuckles white. 3 minutes? 3 minutes in an ER where she had just performed CPR on a man who had collapsed in the hallway? 3 minutes after she had been running nonstop since the start of her shift. "I was handling an emergency." That's not an excuse. The words were crisp, cutting, meant to put her in her place. The other nurses didn't look up. They never did. No one wanted to get caught in the storm. "I'll take care of it now," Melissa said, forcing her voice to stay even. Langford smiled, but it wasn't kindness. It was victory. "You should be grateful, Nurse Tahira," he said, voice dropping just enough so that only she could hear. "I give you more responsibility than most. It's my way of pushing you to be better. You want that, don't you?" Her stomach twisted. It was the same manipulative speech she had heard for years. She worked twice as hard as the others, got half the recognition, and if she dared to push back, she was ungrateful, difficult, not a team player. Dr. Langford turned without waiting for an answer, his white coat billowing behind him as he disappeared into another room. Melissa let out a slow, measured breath. Control. Keep control. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she caught a figure watching her. Shaq hadn't moved from his chair in the waiting area, but his eyes were locked on Melissa. He had seen everything. Not just the argument, but the way Langford spoke to her, the way she absorbed it, the way the entire room pretended it hadn't happened. But Shaq had felt it. That kind of belittlement, subtle, persistent, designed to wear someone down piece by piece until they either quit or learned to live with it. He had seen it in basketball when young, hungry black players were told they were talented, but not leaders. He had seen it in business meetings where people assumed he was just another athlete who didn't understand numbers. And now he was seeing it here, with her. And something about her, the way she stood her ground despite the exhaustion, the way she swallowed her frustration but never lost her fire, felt too familiar, too close. But he couldn't place why. The shift continued. Melissa moved like a soldier on the battlefield, patching wounds, calming fears, saving lives. She was the one patients trusted, the one families clung to when doctors brushed them off. She was also the one given the worst shifts, the most difficult cases, the least amount of support. When an elderly black woman in room 207 needed pain meds, the request sat ignored for 30 minutes, until Melissa noticed and took care of it herself. When a new trainee made a mistake, Langford brushed it off, until Melissa did the exact same thing, and suddenly, it was a mark against her performance. When an intern bumped into Langford, he laughed it off. When Melissa did. "Watch where you're going, Tahira." Shaq sat in silence, his mind churning. How many times had this happened? How many years had she survived this? And most importantly, how the hell did she still have the strength to keep going? By the time the shift neared its end, Melissa's body ached, but she didn't let it show. She checked on her last patient, a 10-year-old boy with asthma, and smiled at him. "You're breathing better than earlier, huh?" The boy nodded, gripping his inhaler like a lifeline. His mother, a tired woman with worry etched deep in her face, squeezed Melissa's hand. "Thank you for actually listening to us." The first doctor barely even looked at him. Melissa felt her chest tighten. It wasn't the first time she had heard it. It wouldn't be the last. She left the room, rubbing her temples, and nearly collided with someone. Someone big. She looked up and found herself face to face with Shaquille O'Neal. Her breath caught. She hadn't even noticed him earlier. But now, standing this close, she couldn't ignore the weight of his gaze. For the first time in hours, someone was really looking at her. Not as a nurse, not as an employee, not as someone who was supposed to endure, but as a person. Something about his expression, something almost like recognition, made her pulse quicken. "Hey," Shaq said, voice deep, calm. "You okay?" She blinked, startled. "What?" "You've been moving nonstop for hours," he said. "I don't think I've seen you stop once." Melissa straightened, pulling her exhaustion back beneath the surface. "That's the job." Shaq held her gaze a beat longer than she expected. There was something in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't place. And for the briefest moment, she had the strangest feeling that this wasn't their first meeting. But before she could say another word, Dr. Langford's voice pierced the air once again. "Tahira." Her shoulders stiffened instinctively. Shaq's gaze hardened, and in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Tahira O'Neal moved through the chaos, her mind a well-oiled machine, anticipating, adjusting, solving problems before they turned into emergencies. She had learned to be faster, sharper, and smarter than the rest, not because she wanted to be, but because she had to be. She adjusted an elderly woman's oxygen mask with careful hands, her voice calm and soothing as she reassured the woman's anxious daughter. Even through the exhaustion, she cared. That was what kept her going. And then, as she turned toward the nurse's station, her heart dropped. Dr. Langford stood there, arms crossed, a clipboard in his hands. His face unreadable, his stance deliberate. But Melissa knew that look. Everyone knew that look. Something was coming. And it wasn't good. "Nurse Tahira, step forward." The command echoed through the emergency room like a gunshot. Heads turned. Conversations stilled. The quiet was worse than any yelling could have been. Shaq, still seated in the waiting area, felt the shift in the air like a sudden drop in temperature. He immediately looked up. Melissa straightened. Her instinct screamed at her to not react, to stay neutral, unreadable. But her stomach coiled tight as she stepped toward him. Langford tapped the clipboard against his palm, his gaze sharp and assessing. He was going to make a show of this. "Tell me," Langford said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Do you enjoy making a fool of yourself?" Melissa's jaw clenched. "Sir?" Langford sighed theatrically, shaking his head as if speaking to a child. "It's bad enough that you can't follow simple instructions, but now you've made an error that put a patient at risk." A ripple of tension spread through the room. The nurses nearby froze, unsure if they should step in or pretend not to hear. Melissa's pulse pounded. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Of course you don't." Langford flipped the clipboard around, holding it up like evidence in a courtroom. "Mr. Klein, room 213. He was supposed to receive his blood thinner at 11 a.m. Do you know what time it was actually administered?" Melissa's mind raced. 12:15. Langford's voice was razor-sharp, cutting through the silence. "More than an hour late. Do you know what could have happened if his condition had worsened? Do you have any idea the kind of lawsuit this hospital could be facing because of your incompetence?" The word incompetence landed like a slap. Melissa felt the weight of every staring eye, the silent judgment pressing in from all sides. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She remembered the case. Mr. Klein. A difficult patient. She had tried to administer the blood thinner on time, but he had refused. He had demanded a second opinion from a doctor before taking anything. It had taken over an hour for Langford himself to finally come in and approve it. And now he was making it look like her failure. She opened her mouth to explain, but Langford wasn't finished. "This is exactly what I've been talking about," he continued, turning slightly so that the other staff members could hear. "You make mistakes, you refuse to take accountability, and then you wonder why you're not getting ahead." Melissa felt something inside her crack. Not anger, but something deeper, something colder. She had worked too damn hard for this. She had endured too much to be spoken to like this, to be made an example of in front of interns, patients, and doctors who already doubted her. She wasn't some fresh-faced rookie making careless errors. She was Tahira O'Neill, the one who covered for others' mistakes, the one who stayed late to fix what had been overlooked, the one who kept this place running. And he knew it. Langford knew exactly what he was doing. The room remained silent. Melissa could feel the eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with relief that it wasn't them in the spotlight. But Shaq? Shaq wasn't just watching, he was seething. His hands clenched, not in anger, but in an attempt to rein it in. He had seen a lot of things in his life, but this was a different kind of fight, one he couldn't solve with power, with money, with influence. This was something deeper. The way Langford looked at her, the way he spoke to her, the way the room accepted it as routine. This wasn't just about a mistake. This was about breaking her down. Shaq's pulse pounded as he glanced around the room, waiting, praying for someone to step in. A senior nurse, a doctor, someone. But no one moved, because this was normal, and that was the real problem. Melissa felt a bitter taste rise in her throat. She had two choices. She could argue, which would only confirm what Langford wanted, that she was difficult, that she couldn't handle criticism, or she could do what she had always done. Swallow it. Move on. Survive. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. It won't happen again. Langford smiled like he had just won a battle. See that it doesn't, he said smoothly, and just like that, the moment ended. Conversations resumed. The hospital returned to business as usual. Shaq's fists remained clenched. Melissa turned, her face blank, her hands trembling slightly as she grabbed the next patient chart. She would not cry. Not here. Not now. She knew this hospital. She knew how this game was played. If she showed even a flicker of emotion, they would use it against her. So she pushed it down, buried it deep, and kept moving. But as she walked past the waiting area, something made her stop. Shaq was watching her. Not like the others. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. But with something else. Something almost like recognition. Her breath hitched, and for the first time she felt it too. That feeling of something unspoken, something she couldn't quite place. But before she could think on it, a new alarm sounded, another patient needed help, and she forced herself to keep walking. Shaq, however, did not look away, because he wasn't just watching anymore. He was waiting. Because this wasn't over. Not yet. Not by a long shot. Tahira O'Neill moved through the hallway in a daze. The sound of ringing phones, beeping monitors, and hurried footsteps all faded into a distant hum. Her pulse was still pounding, the echoes of Dr. Langford's voice cutting through. Her thoughts like a blade. Do you enjoy making a fool of yourself? This is exactly why you're not getting ahead. Her hands were steady as she flipped through a patient's chart, but inside she was crumbling. She had to get out. Not out of the hospital. She had survived worse than this. But just for a moment, just for 1 minute, she needed a space where no one was watching. Her feet moved before she could think, taking her toward the supply closet at the end of the hall. She had hidden there before, years ago, as a young nurse on her first job, when the weight of everything had nearly swallowed her whole. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, the dam broke. Her back hit the shelves as she sank down onto the cold tile floor. Her breath came fast, ragged, her chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. She was not weak. But damn, she was tired. Tired of proving herself. Tired of knowing that if she made one mistake, it wouldn't just be a mistake. It would be a reason to doubt her entire career. She pressed her hands against her temples, squeezing her eyes shut. And then, the memories came. She had been the only black woman in the room. The professor's eyes had skimmed over her, pausing just a beat too long. She had known that look. Are you sure you're in the right place? One of the students had asked, laughing like it was a joke. She had forced a smile, gripping the strap of her backpack tighter. Yeah, are you? They had laughed, but the tension had remained. The first few weeks had been relentless. Professors barely acknowledged her. When she asked a question, it was met with sighs, like she was wasting their time. The real moment, though? That had come 3 months in, during a hands-on training session. She had been paired with a white male student, both of them instructed to perform a basic blood draw. His technique was sloppy. The needle slipped. The patient winced. It's all right, the instructor had said kindly. You'll get the hang of it. Then it had been her turn. Her hands had been precise, steady, careful. She had done the procedure perfectly. And yet, you should be more confident, Tahira, the instructor had said. You're hesitating too much. Hesitating. She had executed it flawlessly, but somehow it still wasn't enough. It had never been enough. Melissa could still see the exhaustion in her mother's eyes, the way she came home late every night from her second job, barely able to stand. She had worked at a cleaning company during the day and a hospital cafeteria at night, just to make sure Melissa could go to school. You're going to be a doctor one day, her mother would say, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. You'll show them what we're made of. Her mother had believed in her when no one else did, and that was why she never let herself break, not in public, not in front of them. Because this fight wasn't just hers. It was generations deep. Melissa let out a slow breath, opening her eyes. The weight in her chest was still there, but she had carried it before. She would carry it again. She wiped her eyes quickly, pulled herself together, and stood. As she reached for the door handle, she hesitated, for just a second, and then she walked out, back into the fire. Shaquille O'Neal sat in his car, staring at the street ahead, but seeing none of it. His hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. The hospital's emergency entrance glowed in the rearview mirror, but he wasn't thinking about the hospital anymore. He was thinking about her. Tahira O'Neal, the nurse who had just been humiliated in front of an entire room. The woman who had held her ground even when it cost her everything. The woman who looked at him with eyes that felt too familiar. Shaq exhaled sharply, his fingers drumming against the wheel. He had spent his whole life fighting battles, on the court, in business, in life. But there was something about what he had witnessed today that shook him to his core. Because it wasn't just injustice. It was personal. His phone sat on the dashboard, the screen dim. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then slowly, he picked it up, unlocking it with a heavy sigh. He scrolled through old photos, each one flashing like a memory from another life. And then, he found it. A picture from decades ago. A young woman with warm brown skin, bright eyes, and a smile that could light up a room. Tasha, the mother of the child he had never known. His chest tightened as he ran a thumb over the screen. It had been so long ago. A love that had burned fast and fierce in his early 20s, before fame had swallowed him whole. Tasha had been different from the women that came after. She hadn't been impressed by his name or his future. She had challenged him, kept him grounded. But when she told him she was pregnant, Shaq had been young, reckless, caught up in the NBA dream. He hadn't known how to be a father. So he had left. She hadn't chased him, had never called. He had buried it. Convinced himself that she had moved on, that the child had never needed him. But now, after all these years, he knew the truth. Tahira O'Neal wasn't just some nurse fighting for respect in a broken system. She was his daughter, and she had no idea. Shaq's heart pounded in his chest, a war raging inside him. What do I do? Does he tell her? Does he walk into that hospital and say, I should have been there. I should have known. I should have fought for you. Or does he stay silent? Because the truth? He had already abandoned her once. Would she even want to hear from him now? Would she even care? Shaq leaned back, staring up at the ceiling of the car. For the first time in a long, long time, he felt helpless. He had spent his life building an empire, becoming a legend, giving back. But all the money in the world couldn't buy him the time he had lost. And the hardest part? He wasn't sure if he could fix it. Not this time. Shaq exhaled, gripping the wheel. The truth was out. It was sitting right there in front of him. But what he did next, that was the part that scared him. Because this wasn't just about telling her the truth. It was about earning the right to be in her life at all. And for the first time in his life, Shaquille O'Neal had no idea how to win. Shaquille O'Neal sat in his car, his fingers gripping the phone like it held the answer to a question he never thought he'd have to ask. The hospital's emergency entrance glowed in the rearview mirror, the sliding doors opening and closing as nurses and patients moved in and out. But Shaq wasn't watching them. His mind was caught in a loop, replaying the way she had carried herself. Tahira O'Neal, the fire in her eyes, the way she held back her pain, swallowed it whole, the way she looked at him, but didn't know him. He exhaled sharply, unlocking his phone and scrolling through his contacts. There were people he could call, people who could find out anything about anyone in minutes. It was the kind of access money gave you, the kind of privilege he rarely used. But this was different. This wasn't about a business deal or an endorsement contract. This was about a mistake made decades ago. And he had to know the truth. Shaq tapped a name on his screen. A few rings. Then a voice. Shaq? It's late, man. What's up? I need a favor. His voice was lower than usual, heavy with something unspoken. There was a pause. Then, the voice on the other end grew sharper. Focused. What kind of favor? Shaq ran a hand down his face, his fingers pressing against his eyes. There's a nurse at St. Mary's, black, mid-30s, name's Tahira O'Neill. I need to know everything about her. Everything? What's this about? Shaq hesitated, staring at his own reflection in the windshield. His eyes looked different, tired, uncertain. Just find out. Please. The voice on the other end didn't question him again. Give me a few minutes. Shaq ended the call and leaned back, his mind spiraling. A name wasn't proof. A resemblance wasn't proof. But his gut wouldn't let this go. And Shaquille O'Neal had learned one thing in life. His gut was never wrong. Minutes passed, each one stretching longer than the last. The phone buzzed in his hand. He answered immediately. Shaq, you're not going to believe this. Shaq's stomach tightened. What? Her full name isn't just Tahira O'Neill, it's... The words slammed into his chest like a freight train. Melissa O'Neill. The world tilted. For a second, Shaq forgot how to breathe. His fingers loosened around the phone. Number no. He had to have heard that wrong. Say that again, he said, his voice hoarse. Her real name is Melissa O'Neill. She's 34, born in Atlanta. Mother's name. But Shaq didn't hear the rest, because suddenly he was 20 years old again. Tasha had been different from the women that came after. She wasn't starstruck by his height or his future in the NBA. She had met him before the fame, when he was just a college kid trying to make a name for himself. She had called him out on his ego, made him laugh at himself, challenged him in ways no one else had. And for a short time, they had been everything. But then, the NBA draft happened. And suddenly, Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a kid with a dream. He was a superstar in the making. Endorsements, contracts, press travel. The distance between them had grown fast. Then one night, Tasha had called him. I'm pregnant. Shaq had gone silent. Shaq, did you hear me? He had heard her. He had just not known what to do with the words. He was 20 years old with a career exploding around him. He was barely keeping up with his own life. How could he take responsibility for another? So, instead of stepping up, instead of facing it, he had left. And Tasha never called again. She didn't ask for money, didn't demand anything from him. And over time, Shaq had buried it, convinced himself that she had moved on, that maybe the child wasn't even his, that it was better this way, until tonight, until her name was staring him in the face, ripping the past wide open. Shaq dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, his hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. The nurse he had watched get humiliated today. The woman who had fought so hard to be seen, to be respected. She was his daughter. And she had no idea. Shaq closed his eyes, his heartbeat thudding against his ribs. He had spent his whole life building things, a career, a legacy, an empire. But the one thing he had never built, a bridge back to the past, a connection to the child he had left behind. Regret clawed at his chest, sharp and unforgiving. How do you make up for 3 decades of absence? How do you face a woman who had survived without you, who had become strong because she had no other choice? Shaq exhaled sharply. He had walked away once. He wouldn't do it again. Shaq reached for the door handle, but his hand hovered there, hesitating. Walking into that hospital would change everything. Once he told her, there was no taking it back. Would she even want to hear it? Would she care? Or would she look him in the eye and tell him he was 34 years too late? For the first time in his life, Shaquille O'Neal didn't have the answer. He was used to winning battles. But this wasn't a game. This was a moment that could either break her more or finally give her the truth she deserved. Shaq swallowed hard. He knew what he had to do, but damn if he wasn't terrified. Still, he pushed open the door. Because some things you can't run from forever. And this was one of them. The hospital was still humming with its usual controlled chaos. Nurses moving swiftly, doctors focused, patients waiting with silent prayers. But beneath it all, something felt different tonight. A slow, simmering tension had settled into the walls, waiting to explode. Tahira O'Neal could feel it too, though she had no idea why. She was standing at the nurse's station, flipping through patient charts, exhaustion settling into her bones like a second skin. The humiliation from earlier still lingered in the back of her mind, but she pushed through, like she always did. Then, her name crackled through the hospital's intercom. "Nurse Tahira, report to the administrative office immediately." Her stomach dropped. The glances from the other nurses told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't good. She squared her shoulders, exhaling through her nose, and walked toward the office with steady steps. Inside the cold, sterile office, Dr. Langford sat behind a polished mahogany desk, tapping his fingers rhythmically against a manila folder. Melissa's gut twisted. She had seen that folder before. Disciplinary actions, performance reviews, complaints. Her heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "You asked for me, sir?" Langford didn't look up. He flipped open the folder, scanned a page, then finally lifted his gaze to hers. Smug, controlled, dangerous. "I received a report today," he said. "A rather concerning one." Melissa stood her ground. "What kind of report?" Langford sighed, shaking his head like a disappointed father. "Multiple staff members have come forward about questionable patient care under your supervision, errors in medication administration, a pattern of insubordination." Her chest tightened. "That's a lie." He smiled, slow and deliberate. "Is it?" Melissa's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I know what this is," she said evenly. "This is retaliation because you didn't like being questioned in front of other people." Langford leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "That's an awfully bold accusation, Nurse Tahira." She forced herself to stay calm. "Who reported me?" Langford smirked. "That information is confidential." Of course it was. This was a setup, a paper trail. A way to push her out without making it look like racism, sexism, or personal vendetta. This was how it worked. This was how they erased people like her. One false report at a time. And no one ever stopped it. Until now. Because before Langford could say another word, the office door swung open so hard it rattled on its hinges. A massive shadow filled the doorway. Shaquille O'Neal. And he did not look happy. The room tilted under the weight of his presence. All 6 feet 11 inches of him towered over the desk, his deep brown eyes locked on Langford like a storm gathering over the ocean. Melissa blinked in shock, her brain short-circuiting. Shaq? What the hell was he doing here? Langford, however, didn't seem fazed. Instead, he arched a brow and leaned back in his chair. "Mr. O'Neal," he said smoothly, "I wasn't aware you were a hospital administrator." Shaq didn't blink, didn't move. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and dangerously calm. "We need to talk, now." The weight of those words hit like a brick to the chest. Langford gave a slow, unimpressed chuckle. "If this is about your friend here, I'm afraid you're overstepping. This is an internal matter." Shaq took a step forward, placing his massive hands on the desk. The wood creaked under the pressure. Langford's smirk flickered. Shaq leaned in just slightly. "You filed a false report against her. I want it gone. Now." Melissa's breath caught in her throat. She had seen powerful men before. Doctors, CEOs, people who thought their money or title gave them control over the world. But she had never seen power like this. Not the kind that came from a paycheck. The kind that came from knowing exactly who you are and daring anyone to challenge it. Langford's jaw tightened. "With all due respect, this isn't your business." Shaq's eyes darkened. "It is now." Langford let out a scoffing laugh. "I see what this is. You're here to play hero." He tilted his head, studying Shaq like he was a curiosity. "I know your type, washed-up athletes looking for their next purpose. You think you can throw your weight around because you have money and fame?" Shaq didn't react. Not at first. Then, slowly, deliberately, he pulled out his phone and placed it on the desk. A photo filled the screen. An old, grainy picture of a young woman with warm brown skin and bright, familiar eyes. Langford's brow furrowed. "What's this supposed to be?" Shaq didn't break eye contact. "Her mother." Langford's face twitched. "Excuse me?" Shaq leaned forward. "Tahira O'Neal isn't just a nurse. Melissa's breath hitched. Shaq's voice dropped. She's my daughter. The air turned electric. The room shrank, silent and suffocating. Melissa went completely still. Langford's smug expression drained. For the first time, he hesitated. His carefully crafted mask cracked just slightly. Shaq didn't blink, didn't move, just let the weight of his words settle into the space between them. Langford was calculating. He was a man used to holding power. But this was a different playing field entirely. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just anybody. And now, Langford wasn't just facing a nurse he could bully. He was facing her father. And that changed everything. Melissa's mind was spinning, collapsing, trying to make sense of what she'd just heard. Shaquille O'Neal. Her father? No, that didn't make sense. Her father had never been there, had never reached out, had never been a presence in her life. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at him, really looked at him. And suddenly, every strange feeling she had earlier, the way he had stared at her, the recognition in his eyes, the intensity of his presence, it all made sense. Shaq turned to her then. His voice was softer now, but still steady. I just found out today. I swear to you, I didn't know. She couldn't speak. She didn't even know what to feel. But Langford was scrambling. This doesn't change protocol, he stammered. We have procedures. You can't just walk in here and... Shaq cut him off. Here's what's going to happen, Doc. The word dripped with quiet authority. You're going to retract that false report. You're going to stop harassing her, and you're going to start treating her with the respect she deserves. Langford's lips parted like he wanted to argue. But he didn't dare. Because he knew, just like everyone else in the room, that the balance of power had just shifted. And Shaq wasn't going to let this go. Langford swallowed hard. And for the first time, he looked afraid. The walls of the hospital suddenly felt smaller, the air too thick, too heavy. The low hum of voices and beeping machines faded into background noise. Tahira O'Neal stood in the center of the storm, staring at the man who had just dropped a bomb that shattered everything she thought she knew. Shaquille O'Neal, NBA legend, business mogul, philanthropist, her father. The words still hung in the air between them, raw and unshaken. Shaq stood there, his massive frame somehow looking smaller under the weight of her stare. I just found out today, he said, voice steady, but his eyes held something she couldn't place. Something like regret, like guilt, like fear. Melissa barely breathed, her body stiff, her fingers curled into fists. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Her father had been a ghost, a story she had trained herself not to care about, a decision made a long time ago by a man who never looked back. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her like he had any right to. She let out a sharp breath, her voice like a blade when she finally spoke. You're my father? Shaq swallowed hard. Yes. The word was heavy. She let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking her head. You were rich, famous, loved by the world, and you never even looked for me. Shaq took a step forward, his voice low, almost pleading. I didn't know. Her heart slammed against her ribs. You didn't know. The words were acid on her tongue. Or you never asked the right questions? Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need confirmation. Because they both knew the answer. Melissa's pulse thundered in her ears. All these years she had watched other little girls with their fathers, pretending it didn't bother her. She had told herself she didn't care, that she had never needed him. But now he was here. And that was worse. Because he had the luxury of feeling bad. She had the burden of living it. Melissa let out a sharp breath. You want to know what's funny? Her voice shook with rage, with something fragile beneath it. I used to wonder what you were like. I'd see your face on TV, see you shaking hands with kids, giving back, smiling like you had the biggest heart in the world. Shaq's face tensed. I told myself you were probably a good man, she said, her throat tightening. You just didn't know about me. Because there's no way someone like you could walk away from his own kid and never look back. Right? Shaq's jaw clenched, pain flashing across his face, but he didn't argue, didn't deny it, because he couldn't. Melissa folded her arms, forcing herself to breathe. "I don't need a father," she said finally, her voice firm, cold. "I never have." Shaq nodded slowly, his face unreadable. "I get that." Her nostrils flared. "Do you?" "Yes." The word cut through her anger, because for the first time since this started, his voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't an excuse. It was just the truth. Shaq exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I deserve to be standing here right now." His voice dropped, rough and raw. "But I won't walk away again." Melissa's chest tightened. "And what exactly do you think that means? You want a redo? You think you can just come into my life now and fix everything?" Shaq shook his head. "I don't think I can fix it." Her breath caught. He looked at her then, really looked at her, like he had spent a lifetime missing something he never even knew was his to lose. "I can't fix the past," Shaq said, his voice thick. "But I can show up now, if you let me." Melissa's throat burned. It would have been easier if he had tried to justify it. If he had said something selfish or stupid. If he had given her a reason to hate him. But this was harder. Because he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was just asking for a chance. And she had no idea what to do with that. Melissa let out a slow, shaky breath, glancing at the hallway where the world was still spinning, like none of this had just happened. She had patients to treat. She had a career to protect. She didn't have time for this. For him. So she looked back at Shaq, meeting his gaze one last time, her own emotions buried under layers of exhaustion and self-preservation. "I have work to do," she said simply. And then, she turned and walked away. Shaq didn't stop her, didn't call after her, didn't try to force something that wasn't ready to happen. He just stood there, watching her disappear into the chaos, knowing this wasn't the end, just the beginning. And for the first time in his life, Shaquille O'Neal had to wait for the only victory that had ever really mattered. The air inside St. Mary's Hospital had shifted. It was subtle at first, a ripple beneath the surface, a quiet murmur among the staff. But by morning, it had become a full-blown storm. Dr. Langford was under investigation. Word traveled fast in places like this. It started with whispers at the nurses' station, then moved through the hallways, catching like wildfire. By noon, even the patients had caught on. "Did you hear? The board is looking into Langford. I always knew something was off about him." Tahira O'Neal listened, but said nothing. She wasn't surprised. Men like Langford always thought they were untouchable, until the moment they weren't. And that moment had come. The hospital's Board of Ethics had called an emergency meeting. A formal complaint had been filed against Langford, citing discrimination, workplace harassment, and multiple instances of professional misconduct. Someone, probably Shaq, had made sure that the report landed on the right desks, with the right people paying attention. And now, Langford's allies were turning on him. The very same doctors who had laughed at his cruel remarks, who had ignored his behavior for years, were suddenly distancing themselves. When Langford walked into the break room that afternoon, conversations died on the spot. A few doctors nodded at him, but no one offered their usual small talk. A group of interns who used to hang on to his every word now barely made eye contact. He wasn't fired, not yet, but he was already finished, and he knew it. Melissa sat at the nurse's station, reviewing patient charts when she felt a presence hovering beside her. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. Langford cleared his throat. "Nurse Tahira." Melissa didn't stop writing. "Dr. Langford." A tense silence stretched between them. Langford had been many things to her. Condescending, dismissive, cruel, but never quiet. And now? Now, he was quiet. "I assume you've heard about the board review," he said finally. Melissa set her pen down, her hands folded neatly on the desk. Then, she looked up. For the first time, Langford wasn't smirking. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced with something smaller. Something like fear. She tilted her head. "I have." Langford exhaled sharply, shifting his weight. "It's politics, you know that." His voice was low, tight. The hospital needs someone to blame, and right now I'm an easy target. Melissa stared at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. Not cruel, not smug, just knowing. Langford's lips pressed into a thin line. Melissa stood. He took a small step back. For the first time in her career, he was the one uncomfortable. And that was justice. The review took 3 days. 3 days of whispered speculation. Of Langford retreating into his office, making desperate calls to whoever still answered. The official outcome? A forced resignation. The board framed it as a mutual decision to protect the hospital's reputation, but everyone knew the truth. Langford was done. Melissa overheard a conversation between 2 senior doctors in the hallway. They're settling with 3 different nurses. If this had gone public, the hospital would have been in serious trouble. Good. It's about time. For years, people had looked away. For years, they had let him get away with it. But now he was just another bad memory in a hospital that would move on without him. And Melissa? She was still standing. The day after Langford left, Melissa walked through the hospital and noticed something different. Nurses who used to look at the floor when Langford passed now held their heads higher. A young black intern stopped her in the hallway. "Thank you," she whispered, voice tight with emotion. "For fighting back." Melissa nodded, feeling something warm in her chest. It wasn't about revenge. It was about change. By the end of the week, her name was called into the hospital director's office. The director, a composed woman in her 50s, motioned for her to sit. "Nurse Tahira," she began. "We want to formally apologize." Melissa stayed silent, waiting. "We failed you," the director admitted. "We should have stepped in sooner. And for that, I take full responsibility." Melissa nodded slowly, her emotions unreadable. "We'd like to offer you a promotion," the director continued. "Head of nursing in the emergency department. You've more than earned it." Melissa blinked. She had worked for years, pushing through, enduring, surviving. And now? Now she was finally being seen. She let out a slow breath. "I'll think about it," she said. The director smiled. "Take your time." Melissa left the office, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. That night, as she stepped outside into the cool air, she wasn't surprised to see a familiar silhouette waiting by the parking lot. Shaq. She stopped a few feet away, crossing her arms. "You always lurking outside hospitals, or is this a new hobby?" Shaq chuckled, the sound deep and warm. "Just making sure you're good." Melissa exhaled, looking up at the night sky. "Langford's gone. I heard." She glanced at him. "You had something to do with that, didn't you?" Shaq shrugged. "Just made sure the right people knew the truth." Melissa studied him for a long moment. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, "Thanks." Shaq's lips twitched. "Was that painful for you?" "A little," she admitted, but there was a flicker of something close to humor in her eyes. Shaq sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Listen, I know I can't fix what I missed, and I know I probably don't deserve a chance." Melissa stayed quiet. "But I'm going to show up anyway," he said, "no matter how long it takes." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then finally, she let out a small breath. "You're stubborn." Shaq smiled. "Runs in the family." Melissa rolled her eyes, but she didn't walk away. She just stood there, watching him, not shutting the door. And for now, that was enough. The hospital had returned to its normal rhythm. Patients came and went, monitors beeped in steady intervals, and nurses bustled between rooms. Life moved on, like it always did. But for Tahira O'Neill, something had shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't something that could be seen or explained in a single conversation. But it was there, lingering. A weight in her chest. A question she hadn't answered yet. And it had everything to do with the man who had walked into her life 34 years too late. Shaquille O'Neal didn't press. He didn't call. Didn't show up at the hospital uninvited. He simply waited. Because this wasn't about demanding space in her life. This was about earning it. One evening, After an exhausting double shift, Melissa found something unexpected in her locker. A small, worn envelope with her name on it. No flashy gestures, no explanation. Just an envelope. She hesitated before, picking it up, her fingers tracing the edges. Inside there were two things. An old photo and a letter. Melissa pulled it out first, her breath catching in her throat. It was faded, the edges frayed with time. But she recognized the woman in the picture immediately. Her mother, Tasha, young and glowing, standing beside a tall, familiar figure. Shaq. Not the basketball legend, not the businessman. Just a young man, barely more than a kid, looking at her mother like she was his whole world. Melissa's chest tightened. She had never seen this before, never seen them together. Her mother never spoke about him. She had raised Melissa alone, never asking for anything, never looking back. But this told a different story, a story where, at least for a moment, they had been something real, something that mattered. She swallowed hard and unfolded the letter. It wasn't long. It wasn't polished. Just a few lines, written in her mother's handwriting. Melissa, I never wanted you to feel like you were missing something. You were always enough. I hope you know that. But if the day ever comes when you need answers, if he ever comes back, I want you to decide for yourself, not because of me, not because of the past, but because you deserve to know the truth, whatever it may be. I love you always. Mom. Melissa sat there for a long time, staring at the paper, her throat tight. Her mother had known. Not that this moment would happen, but that it might. And she had left this choice for her to make. Not in anger, not in bitterness, just in love. Melissa pressed the letter against her knee, her breath unsteady. Her mother had spent her entire life making sure she never felt abandoned. And now, standing on the other side of it, she had to ask herself, was she willing to carry that same distance forever? Or was it time to let herself decide? The streetlights flickered as she pulled into the driveway. Melissa stared at the house in front of her, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Shaq's house. She had driven here on autopilot, her mind still fighting itself. Coming here didn't mean anything. It didn't mean she forgave him. Didn't mean they could fix 34 years of silence with a single conversation. But still, she had come, and that meant something. She took a deep breath, stepped out of the car and walked to the door. For a long moment she just stood there. Then slowly, she lifted her hand and knocked. It took only a few seconds. Then, the door swung open. Shaq stood there, barefoot, dressed in a simple hoodie and sweatpants. No cameras, no crowd, no lights. Just him. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Melissa felt her heart clench. He had been larger than life her entire existence. A legend, a public figure, untouchable. But standing here, he was just a man. A man who had failed. A man who wanted to fix something he couldn't fix. A man who, for once, wasn't sure how to win. They stared at each other. No words spoken, just silence. Melissa felt the weight of her mother's letter in her pocket, grounding her. Then, she stepped inside. And Shaq let her. No expectations, no demands. Just a father and a daughter, trying to find their way across a bridge that had been broken for far too long. And for now, that was enough. Some truths stay buried, some wounds never heal. But when justice calls, will you stand or will you watch? This isn't just a story, it's reality. If this shook you, if this made you think, ask yourself why, and then do something about it.